Welcome to the AI and ML conversations with myself, Yavor Botev. In this podcast, I talk to AI and ML experts about building real-world systems, working with humans and AIs, and exploring the future of our field. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AI and ML conversations with myself, Yavor Botev. Today, I have an amazing guest. I have with me Thomas Schmidt, joining all the way from Germany. Hi, Thomas.
Hey, hi, Abo. Thanks for having me.
The pleasure is all mine. Yeah, Thomas has a very interesting profile. He's maneuvered his career in different industries. In a summary, I would say he moved from agriculture management to building AI agents. So I think that was a super interesting journey, and I'm very interested to hear more about it. But yeah, before this, maybe you can quickly introduce yourself. Yeah, feel free.
Sure, yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. As I said, I'm very curious to be here and talk about AI, ML, and whatever we will dive into today. Yeah, you already introduced me name-wise, so I'm Thomas. I'm living in Munich or very close to Munich. I'm still the country boy, right? So I studied agricultural science. I'm living a bit outside of the city. And yeah, I went through, we probably can dive into this a bit deeper than in a few minutes. I went through agricultural science and then pivoted my career into data and opened the door to data wonderland and got crazy there. So you could say it's an interesting path. Others might say it's a very weird path as well. But I think there's a couple of interesting aspects in there. Yeah, apart from that, I'm like a very curious problem solver, which probably also led me through this path. Eventually in my free time. So when we not talk about work, I'm usually also like doing a lot of sports, climbing, ice hockey from time to time, riding my bike and listening to data podcasts to get to know about new stuff as well. And yeah, let's see where we go today.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a nice way to kick it off. Well, we've already touched upon it a couple of times, but I'm very curious to learn how you decided to transition, or maybe it was not such a big transition, but from agricultural science to being a full-fledged data scientist.
Yeah.
To be fair, I don't know that many people who studied agricultural science, so I don't even know what is in it. But you can maybe share some more details about this, and maybe it was just a natural transition, but yeah, I'm here about what you have to say about that.
Yeah, totally. So maybe to give a little bit of context on how I ended up in agricultural science, it was kind of a straightforward way for me, but also still not. So my parents, they operated a milking farm, so a dairy farm in Germany here. And I was always like, when you're a small boy, you're at home, like help a little bit here and there. You drive the tractor, which is super exciting, right? When you're young. So I got very excited about the topic in general. Like, I always was very curious about animals and also their behavior. Like I love to like watch the cows and try to understand how they behave, because they behave very differently than we, because we are more like the predators type of animals, and they are more like the animals that would like run away from the predators. So they have a very different behavior, and I always found this very interesting to watch, and also in general to understand like how we grow our food and how this all of that works. So this is why I then eventually decided that I also want to go down that road and at least explore agricultural science a bit more. So I started my bachelor's degree there. Then also went through the master's degree, where I specialized a bit more on organic farming and also on animal behavior. So as I said, since I was very interested into that topic, that's something where I dived a bit more into then. And then the fun thing is that I think up until the end of my master's degree, I haven't really touched anything code related or data related too much. I mean, I was always into maths and statistics. That's something I liked at school and at university as well. So that's usually the stuff you do as a researcher as well. So I would consider this at least part of my journey back then. But it wasn't really about writing code too much. I mean, I heard about R as a programming language in our statistics course, but didn't really do something with it. And then during my master thesis, I was working with a company that produces automatic calf feeders. So where the small cows, they go into like such a station, they get registered, and then they would get their milk prepared. And they had a new prototype that they were developing, which was to measure the activity of the calves. So one thing was the activity while they drink. So usually the small cows, they would nudge the udder a bit to kind of stimulate it. And that's what you see in those automatic calf feeders as well. So they would bump a bit against the teat. And then we developed a teat that was like movable. So, and we could measure the activity with a small Raspberry Pi back in time, which generated a bunch of data. And then they also had like a collar where we also, it's like measuring steps basically. So has been used a lot for heat detection in cows already, which is a way different story. But it's kind of similar. And then you could say, so now if the calves have all this, like produce all this data, can't we actually figure out when they get sick just from the data? And ideally early on before you even see some symptoms.
Yeah.
And the idea is clear, right? So if they are sick, they might not move so much anymore. They might not drink so much anymore and so on. So that was kind of the idea of my master thesis, to like do some like pre-studies whether this would be possible. And yeah, I started with Excel. This Excel file grew and grew and grew because the raw data I collected was a lot, right? And I thought like Excel is super nice and you can handle all that stuff, but it reached a point where you just clicked somewhere and you just clicked. I didn't like type anything, and it took 20 minutes to, I don't know, to refresh, calculate, whatever it did then. So this was basically unusable. And then I went to the engineers and asked them whether they could help me. And the engineers were super busy, so they didn't have time for me. And I was like, damn it. Then I just, let me figure this out on my own. And then I was like, okay, I thought like coding is so difficult and that's something I will never try. And I just went online and did a weird R YouTube tutorial, which was actually a lot of fun. And then I started typing like out my logic that I had in Excel into R. I hit the button, and like after a few bugs and after I fixed them, it basically instantly calculated stuff. And I was like, okay, that stuff is powerful. And then I got super curious about it, went deeper into R and like did all my master thesis, like the programming stuff with R. And naturally, since this is a task, like predicting when calves get sick, it's kind of a task where you naturally come to machine learning at some point when you try to figure out how to solve such problems. That was then when I opened this door and was like, wow, okay, this is something super exciting and very interesting. So there was this statistical and math aspect of it that I liked, but also like this just, it felt so magical. And back in time, machine learning was very hyped as well, right? So same as like Gen AI today, where everybody thinks like you can solve all the problems with it. I thought the same. So I went heads down into it and used it for my master thesis. But I also early on figured out that it's not that easy. So if you have like shitty data, then this also doesn't work. Still the same problem today, which we probably can also talk about a bit later. So that was when I opened this door to Data Wonderland. And then I worked with the company for a little bit longer, and we planned to do a PhD on exactly like this moving teat idea, because we figured out. So, but I don't want to go into details there. But just as a TLDR, there's a huge problem that the calves would suck on each other's I don't know, like udders and so on. And this is usually developed very, very early on when they are young. And you don't see this in the natural habitat too much. So in their natural behavior, that's usually not part of it. So it's like a kind of a misbehavior. And the hypothesis is that this also comes from like very early on how we feed them and so on. And we thought that there's some potential interesting thing there, that maybe if we don't give them milk full speed and stop it full speed again when we feed them, but do like try to simulate a more natural flow as it would come in the mother's udder as well, and that potentially we could try to avoid this type of behavior later on. This would kind of just make it more natural for them. And we wanted to do a PhD on that. But the kind of like the conditions that were in there for like doing the PhD didn't feel super right. So we would need to commute a lot between Munich and then at the company was at the Bodensee. And then I started just to reconsider whether this is really what I want. And since I got so excited about this whole data thing, I was like, no, actually, I need to do that. That's way more exciting. And here's probably the tip for all the new folks out there. So in Germany, we have this huge problem that you need a certificate for everything. So I didn't study that, right? So like applying for a job there is almost impossible. So I almost went to university again, but very luckily I bumped into a startup, which are good places to start if you are super motivated and you think you can do that stuff. And the CTO back in time was talking to me, was like, you're so stupid. Like, why would you go to university again? Just start full time with us and you learn everything in 6 months. And he stayed right. So yeah, this is the TLDR of my switch. And this was then a Agritech company. So that was then where I started as a data analyst back in time and then turned into data scientist, and did a lot of fun work there as well.
Wow, so super interesting story and a few interesting learning points. Indeed, also I've seen as a professional is that while the university education degree is good, it's some sort of a check mark exercise. Pretty much all the knowledge you can learn on your own nowadays with YouTube, with lectures. I was even looking at some Stanford lectures the other day, and I was thinking, hey man, like I didn't study this in university. And the people who are now graduating from these with machine learning and data science degrees probably have a better theoretical knowledge than I do. But the nice thing is, of course, I can always go ahead and look at the same materials that they're looking. So that's very liberating. But one thing I wanted to ask you about your agriculture science degree, because from what I understand, it was mostly your natural curiosity to work on or to solve problems with data science and machine learning that led you to this path. But in the degree itself, is there some sort of a trend to motivate the students to think about how to make their own research studies and how to properly analyze the data? Or was it something that you as an individual had to push for?
No, I think it's like it's probably a science like many others. So there is a lot of, I don't know, nudging and motivation for folks to also do their thing. You start with your bachelor's degree. I think this is where you like do the first big research. And I guess it's very similar to other places as well, where you would do your statistical analysis and you apply those techniques as well. I also feel that in agriculture, it's a very weird business because it's on the one hand side, there are things that are super conservative. And on the other hand, there's stuff where like there's crazy technology involved already. So I think agricultural topics, they also like years ago already reached into machine learning and AI. And when I don't know, like I think there's applications where maybe drones are flying around and they are counting the apples of the apple trees in a plant or something like that. And there's a lot of stuff like that where there's like image recognition and all those things applied. Or then also with the cows, sometimes you have like those models to detect when they are in heat and like all those things. Like it's very, and there's even robots milking the cows. So like there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. And on the other side, there's also a lot of conservative things. But yeah, to answer your question, I think there is a natural tendency to also like just do your research as in any other expertise. But you're also totally right. So I think the main driver for myself to then pivot eventually was the curiosity. So I love to learn new things, and that was something that got me super excited. And I felt like, okay, this is something that feels very natural to me somehow, and I have the feeling that I can have a real big impact when I go further into that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with some of the things that you can do as a data scientist, machine learning engineer, you can really push, like move the needle on the business side for whatever thing is that you're trying to solve. And that is very, I would say, empowering.
Yeah.
If I compare it to being, well, of course, as a software engineer, you can build products that are very meaningful and solve a real customer's need. But I personally like to have a machine learning model and see it doing better and better in predicting whatever it's trying to predict. But yeah, but in terms of machine learning models and data science, in your experience in the agricultural tech startup that you mentioned, how did that go? Because as a startup, I can imagine that you built a lot of things, a lot of proof of concepts. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work. So yeah, what's an interesting data science topic that you can share from that experience?
Yeah, I think like there's a couple of interesting aspects. So the first of it is that I think there's very few use cases where machine learning makes sense. um, or like where it has a real impact. I think there's a lot of things where it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But when I started there, I was like, oh yeah, we're going to do so much machine learning and stuff, right? Because I was so into the topic. And then I quickly learned early in my career, luckily, that we should be very careful with those tools that we have, because if there's something hyped or we like it a lot, there's this tendency to always apply it, right? So this is our hammer, and then everything looks like a nail. And what I learned early on is that sometimes a simple if-else statement can do the job, and it can do it way better than a machine learning model that you need to train first, and it has like some errors that it does and so on. And I feel like the most important thing there, like my most important first learning was really like communication is very important. So you need to like talk to people and understand what the problems are, because often they would come to you and say, hey, like, yeah, I need Thomas, I need this data, or can we build this machine learning model? But very often you need like the I don't know, the most important skill is to be able to say no, and to be able to explain and say, hey guys, I think this is not the solution to the problem you're having. You're having a very different problem, or you need a very different solution to the problem you have.
Yeah.
And often people are not that great in also realizing this. I have the same things on my own often, where I'm thinking like this is the solution, and sometimes there's a bit of bias because like I like that tool or something.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of courage to like take the step back and say, no, wait a second, like I think this is not the right thing to do. So we didn't do that much. We did do machine learning, but the machine learning thing that we used once was just a simple linear regression, because it just did the job. And I think that was about, I don't recall, what was it? I think we tried to, so like we had this trading platform where basically farmers, retailers, and producers were kind of coming together. And the farmers would request certain things that they need, like a fertilizer, and then the retailers in their region, they could make a quote for that. And then we tried to do some market potential analysis for the retailers. And we took some like publicly available statistics of certain agricultural regions, and from that we try to predict what's their market potential and how could they grow. And there were a couple of things where we needed to estimate, I don't know what it was, like how many biogas plants are there or something like that. And there was not so much data on that, and we could very simply kind of do that from how much corn was built in that area, and there was a pretty good correlation, so that we could use a simple linear regression model to kind of get to that. And that's it. So like, it's no rocket science, right? And often we think like there's so many things where machine learning has this crazy impact, but most of the time it's like a simple small thing that still can be very impactful for what you need to do later on.
Yeah. Exactly. So in general, we as technical people try to get focused on some algorithms and how to increase, let's say, the accuracy of a model from 90% to 93%. But if you take a step back and look at the big picture, there are all kinds of other business decisions and processes that we probably have to care more about. Like, first, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Is that really the problem? For this, I actually wanted to ask you, what do you think, maybe not just about this company or experience, but just in general, what do you think is the importance of other people that you work with as a um, data scientist or machine learning engineer, people like product, maybe senior management, the CEO, because they determine the direction of the company. And oftentimes I've seen that they make decisions based on maybe something they've read or something that investor told them, but not necessarily it's not necessarily based on analysis or data-driven decision making or real customer need. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a really good topic. So I think the decisions they make is based on the context they are in, right? So it's not that they make a decision and they want to fuck up the company. Ideally, they want to bring it forward,
In most
right?
cases.
Yeah, in most cases. And I was actually thinking maybe I need to write a book on that one day called "Context is All You Need." Not attention is all you need, but context is all you need. I think throughout my career, this is like the one red line thingy that always pops up all the time, is that I feel when you work together with other people, it's so important to have a sense of the context and where you miss context and where other people are missing context. And there's like those two things, right? So there's pulling in information so that you get more context and can take better decisions, but also pushing out information so that others get a better context. And I think this is one of the, I don't know, the biggest problems that I see in like the whole industry is that we usually are very, like, humans are very bad in providing context. You see this when we work with LLMs, like they always get confused. But the same, just you don't need the LLMs for that. You just like need to look at some Slack threads and see on things. And I've seen a couple of situations where, I don't know, somebody was asking about some data, maybe me or somebody else went off for 3 hours. You come back just to realize, it's actually not what they were asking for because they had a different problem, right? And this is something, I guess, where we also all need to get better. And that's probably also the thing when you see decisions that you find weird from a CEO or somebody else, then usually I'm always like, at Shopify, I love this. We had this term that I loved a lot, which was always assume good intent. And usually people have good intent if they take decisions for the company. So if you find something very weird that you don't understand, I always feel like it's my task to ask and figure out why. Like, if I don't understand why we're doing things, I, as an individual contributor or manager or whatever, I need to go there and get the context to figure out why. And maybe I have context that the others are missing that would actually change this decision. And this can be quite impactful, right? So it's maybe just a single conversation that can switch the whole strategy, where it's like, okay, I didn't know that thing, but that changes the whole story. And then we should maybe actually not do that, but do something else. And I feel that people often shy away from those discussions. So what I often see is that you maybe have individual contributors in the team. Everybody's just complaining about the management and, oh yeah, why do we switch directions all the time? And like, this is super weird and I don't fully understand it. But that's a sign of somebody doing a bad job. So either yourself, that you don't ask for that context, or your manager, that they should usually provide that context, right? But I feel like if there's something I can change about the situation, I would just do it. Or in the ideal case, I also don't always do it, probably. But in the ideal case, you should just do it if you feel there's something wrong about the situation, not always just blame the others. Yeah, so that's kind of my thoughts on data-driven decision or stuff. It's mostly about context. Sometimes the missing context is a data point. Sometimes the missing context is just something else that doesn't need a fancy data analysis, but just like a small conversation where you try to exchange this. And it's not only in business, it's also in our personal life, right? So probably you've also experienced this where you write a WhatsApp message to someone, and then when we have written communication, that makes things even worse, because in spoken communication, you have your whole mimic and gestic and stuff, and how I like work with my hands. You see whether I'm smiling or not. And if I'm just writing a text, I mean, there's emojis, but they might also be misleading sometimes. And sometimes you can end up in really weird situations where somebody's really angry at you suddenly because you wrote something and you just meant it totally different than how they read it, because maybe when they read it, they were in a sad situation, and then they also tend to interpret that stuff differently. So that's probably something where I want to do a bit more research as well and see how can we like improve this as a society. Also work-wise or in personal life.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking about the personal life, just yesterday I was chatting with my fiance about something, and then I used a certain word. Can't even, because I did it in Bulgarian, so I can't really translate it well in English. But she didn't like the connotation of the word. Like, to her, it had a negative connotation, and to me, that was like a very neutral word, and I didn't mean it in this bad way. But yeah, like if I had indeed written it down like this, I can imagine that somebody reading it would definitely misinterpret at least what I intended to convey. Yeah. That's why, as a bit of a, again, side note, I prefer to have conversations in a remote company, with my camera on, because as you say, there is so much more information that you see. You can also connect better with your colleagues, which is very important when you're working for a remote company. But if we go back to the thing that we were discussing, the context is indeed super important. Yet you have to balance giving all the potential information that you have to everybody and not drowning them in data and with noise. And for this, I think there has to be a company-wide policy, or at least the culture on how you should disseminate the right context information to everybody. So have you seen any good practices in that regard? Maybe any bad practices, things that the company should try to stay away from? Yeah. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's probably a lot of stuff there. So I guess when I specifically think about fully remote companies where you're not
Mm-hmm.
in the office and there's a lot of written communication, then one thing that stands out to me is that we 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 tend to write Slack messages just how they appear in our head, right? So you just you
Mm-hmm.
write some stuff down, and I think it makes sense that before you send it, that you read through it again and think how you can shorten it. So there's a really interesting book. I think it's called Writing Without Bullshit.
Oh.
That's also touching those aspects where we use a lot of fill words. Sometimes we I don't know, tend to bombard people with data and so on. So it really makes sense to kind of switch perspective. So that's what I sometimes try to do, where I'm thinking, what is my audience? Like, who am I writing this to? And what situation are they in? What words do they understand? So like imagine someone from marketing writing something in Slack. You read this, they often have a lot of acronyms and terms that others don't understand. So I should not use those acronyms then if I'm communicating to somebody else, right? So ideally, or if I'm communicating to marketing, it's okay to use those acronyms because they would fully understand. So I think this is one best practice I saw, that you like stop for a second and think what you want to have. And the other one is that what we did at Shopify often was that we also tried to put TLDRs in front of things. So when you write a longer Slack messages or something, you would put a TLDR up front, so for folks to be able to quickly skim through that and scan that. And then you have the bigger part in the thread somewhere separate or like below, so that people can quickly also scan whether this is information they need to parse or whether they can just like skip this for now. So that's definitely another good practice that I saw working very, very well. And yeah, in general, just like try to keep your communication on point. So if you want to update someone on what you're working on today because this is important for them, then the others might not need to know about all your one-on-ones that you have today if you write this message, but maybe just the stuff that's important to others, right? So there's a lot of fluff and unneeded information that we usually put out there, and it really makes sense to think about who's your audience and what is the message you want to convey, and then optimize your message for that. And that is a lot of work sometimes. So it's not that you just like quickly write your Slack message. And sometimes it's okay to quickly write your Slack message, depending on what it is, right? But there are situations where I think it makes sense to stop for a second and rethink. And that doesn't only apply for Slack messages, but also when you present something to stakeholders. If you create presentations, like be sure upfront who is your audience and what wordings and message you want to use there.
And what do you think about rituals? Things like daily stand-ups, weekly retros, quarterly reviews. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, rituals. I think so. I'm a very, very big fan of retros. So in this first startup that I worked at, like called Agrando, it doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. I think one of our core tools for improvement was retros. So we sat down. It was a very honest environment and a very safe spacey environment where people knew that they can't say anything So it's like, okay, like I was really obsessed about that situation, or this was just total shit. This was a
Mm.
shit show. We shouldn't do this anymore. Why did this happen? And it felt like we could go in there, be very honest, and after that, everybody would just be fine with everybody else, right? So it would not be like, now I'm angry at you because you said that I did some weird things. But we talked honestly about that, and that ended up in situations where we had so many cool improvement ideas for the process. And then like after a couple of retros, like this goes into like a flywheel where this thing just self improves over time. Because then, I mean, there are points, and when you realize that the points that come up in the retro, they are not so valuable anymore, which is a good sign for we might have reached a really good state. And what was quite interesting, or what the challenge there is, I think, is to create this safe space. So um, when I joined that company, we were like, I don't know, 20 people.
Mm-hmm.
And then after a while, we grew to 150. So there were a lot of people joining. And that's like a huge potential for culture shift as well. And when we had those retros with the engineering team, so I was like, I was the only data person for a while then.
Mm-hmm.
Then I also got a small team that I managed with some data scientists. And then we were always embedded in the engineering team. So we worked very closely with them. We also did a lot of full stack development apart from the data stack. And then we had this retro with the engineering team. A lot of new folks were joining, and you could see that they watched these things from the outside, right? So it's very important to lead with example. So if you want to have a culture, then you should lead with example and show what you want to do, like, and also like talk about those things.
Yeah.
So they were always like super careful not to say too much. But if they see that like some folks would talk about stuff where they're like, oh my God, like, can you say this publicly? Then they would follow that lead, right? So they would see, okay, it's actually okay. It's like nothing happened to them. They are still at the company. So maybe I could talk about my problems as well. So that's an important thing for retro, I guess, to create this safe space. And apart from that, other rituals, I think for stand-up, it depends. So they can be useful, but they also quickly can go into something where it's just like, I'm just talking in a way that everybody else realizes that I'm busy. I'm doing work, right?
Yeah.
So I see this sometimes with our standard. So at Metabase, where I'm working right now, we're also fully remote and totally async. So we work across the globe. So there, we usually have stand-up messages, and they are very important. So if I wake up early in the morning, and then the US folks, they ended their day, then for me, it's very important to see like what have they been working on, what did they end their day with, or also the other way around when I'm like writing down my plan for the day. So there's some kind of thing where you can figure out, okay, what is this other person up to, and can I help there, or is there something important for me that I can pull out in terms of information? But then, yeah, you need to be careful that this doesn't end up in today I'm having this one-on-one with that person and that one-on-one here and this meeting there. It's like, yeah, it's not so helpful for me. Like that, I cannot. And this is this thing, right? When you think about who am I writing this for? Am I writing this for just myself as a list, or am I writing this for someone where it's like, hey, here I'm blocked, here I need help? Like this is, I think, where startups can be very helpful to unblock people. But there's this tendency that they can quickly go into something where it's more like I'm just listing my work items. That it looks like I'm busy.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of the downside of it. But apart from that, huge fan of retro. So I think this is the number one thing that always worked out very, very well for me. And then for the other stuff, you need to figure it out for your team what works for you. And there the retros can help, right? If you figure out, hey, stand-ups are not helpful, how are we doing them? Then you talk about it, and then you can change the process a little bit.
Yeah. Retros are definitely a nice way to first lead by example, and also to improve the culture of learning and continuous development in your company, because that's very often not the case. Like to me, one of the lowest hanging fruits is a culture of learning and learning based on your mistakes. And still not so many companies and people are doing it. Many times individuals are busy with their day-to-day tasks, and they don't have time to think a little bit more deeply into why certain thing didn't go as planned last week. And yet that's such a valuable thing to learn and to integrate in your life. So one of the companies that you've worked for, Shopify, has very popular in about its unique way of working. What would you say is one of the most interesting things about working there?
Yeah, I think Shopify was a really great place to work, so I really enjoyed it there.
Mm.
The interesting thing about it is that it's a very big company, but it still feels like you are in a startup. So there's a lot of short short ways to other people, like super easy to communicate with everybody. There's a lot of super smart people there. So I think one of the core things when you join Shopify is the imposter syndrome, that you always feel like, what am I doing here? Like the people are all so smart, but there is something you can contribute to it, right? So that's usually the tendency when you start there for your first day. It's like, oh my god, like they are all so smart. But that's the cool thing. That's a really cool learning environment, and like since I'm so curious about all this stuff, I enjoyed this so much. So there was a huge transparency as well around certain, like you could follow all the projects that happen. Shopify has their own kind of like project management system
Mm-hmm.
that they build up. And it was very easy to like subscribe to some projects where you think I could have a stake on, or I'm just curious about how they work. So there was a lot of openness in the policy on the information, and if you wanted to, you could participate there across your team. So there was an
Mm.
so if you wanted to have impact across your team, that was an easy road you could go down. Obviously, you need to balance it with your normal work and stuff. But I felt very encouraged to do that when working at Shopify. So that was something very interesting. And then obviously there's like at this scale, there's a lot of very interesting technical challenges to solve as well, where you can also learn a lot from other teams. And they're usually very open to also share what they are doing. So yeah, because of this open culture, you can just like, I don't know, Slack someone or just go into like an open Slack channel from a team and say, hey, folks, like, how does this work? They would
Yeah.
always explain it to you, or you could easily book a coffee chat with somebody else and have a great conversation. So there was also this huge trust that
Mm.
people brought to you. So like this one thing was the always assume good intent, which I liked a lot. And the other concept that we had at Shopify was the trust battery, where Toby said it's like you join the company and then your battery is half charged. So you give kind of
Mm.
like you get a pre-charging of trust. And then depending on how you behave, it would like discharge or or charge more, right? And I like this image because it's very nice, because you get this feeling, I'm fresh here, nobody knows what I'm doing, but they would assume that they can trust me, at least to some extent. And they would be very open. And obviously, if you abuse that trust, then your battery discharges. But if you do great things, then it would charge, and people would trust you even more. But it's not that you start with 0; it's that you start with 50%, and then you can go from there. So that was something I loved a lot about the culture, and that like made me fly a lot in there.
Mm.
So that was so cool to be able to have impact on all kinds of ends. Dive into certain things, learn a lot new things. So that was something that was really nice.
Yeah. Nice. That's great to hear. We talked about the importance of being a personal example for the values that you say, and I think the CEO of Shopify is definitely one such person. At least from the outside, that's what he looks like. He's very inspiring dude. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about Shopify is what about the technical standards? For instance, um, testing your code, having the right CI/CD pipelines, because like Shopify is such a big company, and you already briefly mentioned about some of the technical challenges there. But how, in your experience, how does working for a large company like Shopify differs than working for a smaller company like Metabase for you right now,
Mhm.
or maybe for your agri-tech startup? What's the big difference in terms of technical standards that you've seen?
Yeah. So I felt actually in the startup back in time, I was super lucky that this was my first job in data,
Mm-hmm.
because everybody was very into like software engineering best practices and how we operate. It felt like there was a super high standard. The problem now is when I see other companies, I thought this is the standard, right? Like joining Shopify after that, you see something very similar, very high standards on testing your code, on documenting your stuff as well openly. And that's a challenge in a lot of other companies, where it's like usually it's not a given. Like people don't document their things too well, or test everything in a well way. And it's not an easy thing, right? So you need a good setup first. You need to build that. Back in time in the startup, we need to build it from scratch. So I also like with my team, we built the whole data warehouse and the whole data stack, and that's a challenge. Like if you start from scratch and build everything in a way that it's also easy to self-serve, that's very tough. So I felt at Shopify, obviously the pieces were in place, so the pipelines were there and so on. You could just like use the infrastructure and build on top of it. But in general, obviously, there's always room for improvement. And I'm sure if you ask some folks at Shopify today, they would also still say, hey, like we can improve here, this and there. But I felt like the overall standard was pretty high. So like to give you one example, when you work in data and you build data models and stuff, then usually documentation is the first thing that falls short. So
Yeah.
you might see an orders table where the description says this table contains the orders. It's like, yeah, okay. And
Go
there's
figure
nothing
it
about,
out.
yeah, exactly. There's nothing about like, what's the granularity of that thing? What was this model built for? So what was its purpose? What should it be used for? What should it not be not used for? And maybe some playbook examples. And I felt Shopify had a really good standard there. So we had a nice like template for how to document things. And there was a lot of really good data foundation there. Obviously, there's also some chaos here and there, as everywhere. But in general, I felt like this was a really good standard. Also, in terms of how we tested the data models and the logic in there, especially the business logic things, or like also just the technical logic,
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot interesting aspects there where I was like, that's actually really good. And it wasn't so new to me because we did it very, very similar in the startup, luckily.
Mm.
But then when you go to other places, you might see that these are things that fall short. And then when we talk about Gen AI today, I think this is one of the big problems for the industry, because back in time of machine learning, everybody thought this is the magic thing that can solve everything. We quickly realized that there's this garbage in, garbage out problem. So you cannot train a machine learning model on some garbage data because the result will also just not be useful. And now with LLMs nowadays, it's a very similar problem. I think it's just easier to understand. Like if you have a good mental model of, I know, pick the best data analysts, put them into a company that they like haven't worked before. And on their first day, they will struggle as well. Like they will struggle to find the right data. If the CEO would come and like say, hey, can I don't know, do a churn analysis? And maybe they did 30 churn analysis in their past already. They know this by heart. But if they don't know like which tables to use, and then there are like, I don't know, 2 customer tables that are slightly different, and what is the difference and so on, they have the
V1
exact same
and V2.
problems. Yeah, or temporary table 1, temporary table 2, do not use this one, and then it still looks useful. And the LLMs would struggle in the exact same way. So that's my daily business at Metabase nowadays, when we build this AI analytics agent, which we can probably also touch on a little bit if you're interested. But that's, I think, a thing where I felt that Shopify had the pieces in place to have a like data foundation that is easy to use then also later on with AI nowadays. And I have the feeling that they can also benefit from this a lot today already. And I think that's what a lot of companies don't do that well yet. And also like, I mean, I guess in the data world, a lot has changed. Like with DBT and those tools for data modeling, there is a lot of software engineering best practices pushing into the market, so that it's like if you use this tool, it's like a low-hanging fruit for you to do some uniqueness tests and stuff like that. So people start using this more. It's less hacky than maybe 4 years ago, where the typical data scientist would just play with Jupyter notebooks and you would deploy those. This still happens, but it's less prominent. So yeah, that was something that I
Yeah.
felt was really nice at Shopify in
Yeah.
terms of the standard and how folks also were living that.
Yeah. What you say about indeed data scientists working on Jupyter notebooks, that's I guess still happening, but there has been this definite trend in the industry for data scientists and machine learning engineers to be full stack and to be able to do everything from data engineering to building models to deploying them on Kubernetes if you want. And that actually has continued even further, I would say, with the rise of being an AI engineer, where what I'm seeing right now is that there are a lot of people who used to be software engineers and are now starting to, well, have become AI engineers, which means that they have learned how to call LLM APIs. I'm joking a little bit here, but there's definitely a difference between understanding in detail how the machine learning model that you built works and just using an LLM. So there has been a lot of transition actually in this field recently. So you have now kind of transition. Well, your background is data science, so you've now moved into an AI engineer, and yeah, I'd be very interested to talk to you about this, and especially about the AI agent work you've been doing. But maybe before this, one thing I wanted to ask you is how do you, when we speak about LLMs, how do you use LLMs in your personal life? Are there any special things that you do that you don't do?
Yeah, that's good to say. So like I'm also guilty of that title, right? So on LinkedIn, I also have this AI engineering title. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
also one of those folks who ride the hype.
Mm-hmm.
But to be honest, for me, I don't care about titles too much. For me, it's more about solving the problems, and whatever tools I have in the toolbox, I'm trying to use them for the benefit of the problem. The reason why I have this title there, just as a side note, is that it's easier to connect with the community. So it's like easier to find other people that are kind of like working on similar problems so that you can easily exchange. So that was like my main motivation to also put it there. But yeah, how do I use them in personal life? I think there's a couple of aspects where I found them very useful. So in the full remote environment, you don't always have a buddy like in the office back in time. It was easy to like stand at the coffee machine and have a quick chat about your problem, right? So you do some ideation. Hey, I'm having this problem. I have those types of ideas. What else could you think of? And to kind of like do these brainstormings, think about certain approaches. I'm using LLMs a lot. So like I would talk to whatever, then Claude or some other model, depending on my rate limits, whatever. And then I would use them for like those brainstorming sessions. So like I have a specific problem and I have an idea in mind. I would not tell them about my idea yet, but just like try to like keep the context fresh. The problem with that is that LLMs tend towards the average, right? So like if you are fresh in a topic, they can be very, very helpful.
Yeah.
If you know a lot in that topic already, you probably know more than like you know better than what the LLM would kind of average towards. But it's still very helpful to get like a fresh perspective where it's like, okay, sometimes there's aspects in there where it's actually, wait, that's actually a cool idea, or like parts of that are a cool idea. And that's something I found very helpful. The challenge is to figure out the slop. So I guess when you worked in the industry for a little bit, then you develop this sense or like this thing, like I always call it smell. So when I'm reading something, it's like, it feels like good ideas, but I have this feeling that it smells like there's still something better there, even if I don't know yet. But I have this feeling that there must be a better approach. And then I continue searching. And you also need to know when to start because sometimes there's just no better approach. But that sense is very helpful when you work with LLMs. So yeah, that's one part where I use them a lot. Then I use them for some coding things as well, like for writing some tests. So like to get me to the first 80%, so I could parallelize some things. So I'm working on something, then I let it maybe generate the tests already, or like do this subtask. So it's more like a management thing, right? And if I can give it enough context, which is also important for the LLMs, then I would let them do certain things, do something else in parallel, then come back, see the result, curate it a little bit, but yeah, often to kind of like solve this empty page problem, or also just to prototype. There I would usually not care too much about the code quality and stuff. It's like, I just want to POC this really quickly and see whether what I have in mind actually makes sense, or whether I bump into some more unknowns that I still need to figure out. So for that, they are also very helpful. In my Metabase life specifically, it's very helpful for writing Clojure. So I haven't done so much Clojure yet, and it feels like a very, very different language in terms of how you think about things compared to Python or other things I've worked with in the past. So that's something which is also very powerful because I know best practices and I know like how to architecture things, but then I might just not know how to type it out in Clojure, and then this can be a shortcut for me to like get somewhere where I could read it and then say, okay, that makes sense, or it doesn't make sense, at least like from my non-Clojure knowledge. And I would still need somebody to like from the Clojure side to help me out with that. But for like prototyping or connecting the dots or quickly get shit done, it's very helpful. I
And
guess those are the typical applications.
Yeah. Do you see that people sometimes reach towards LLMs a little bit too much? Let's say they have some sort of a question in their mind, and rather than trying to spend literally 5 minutes to think about it, they immediately reach for LLMs. And that's also a little bit related to what I've seen about Shopify. I think that one of the recent goals is that the first thing you'd reach towards is using LLM whenever you need some sort of a tool. And I think in many ways that's good, but sometimes that also means that you don't use your natural thinking ability as much as you used to. Have you seen something like this?
Um, yeah, I think I've also seen this with myself sometimes,
Mm.
that I don't think, but immediately go to the LLM for something, and it's like, oh man, yeah, that's obvious. But it feels like a little bit like back in time, also when like Google started to become more prominent. There's often things where you Google them and it's like, yeah, okay, I could have known that. With LLMs, obviously, it's probably a bit more dangerous because they would just give you way more than a search result where you still need to go through things and so on. Yeah, so I have seen that. I have also seen this with some other people. So there's definitely this. Yeah, I'm not sure like how dangerous it is. I sometimes feel like there's this danger for like brain rot there as well, where you just like you're not train yourself anymore on those things, and just let it do the other stuff. On the other hand, like I haven't made up my mind on that yet. It's like also when you
Hmm.
go back in time, almost nobody's writing assembly code anymore.
Mm.
There's like good abstractions for that. And it's not bad if you don't know that because you just don't need it. And if you need it, you can still like go into it and learn it a bit more.
Yeah.
So there's this aspect of that where I'm sometimes thinking maybe it's like also just another abstraction layer that we would use for certain things. Yeah, but I still haven't made up my mind yet because it also
Mm.
feels that there are things beyond the LLM where it's good to have some experience, or like also what I said before, like this smell of there's something better, and it feels like it's potentially harder to develop that. It's very cool if you are fresh into an area and you don't know nothing about it to like quickly
Yeah.
get up to speed and learn things and potential solutions and so on. So for that it's great. But if you want to go beyond the capabilities of an LLM, beyond the statistical average, then you will have a tough time at some point. But there's a lot of, I guess, a lot of reasonable
Mm.
cases where just go for the LLM and
Yeah.
don't think too much. Just like it's a matter of efficiency sometimes, but yeah. Then on the other hand, also like how good is that as a long-term strategy? I don't know yet. We need to figure
Yeah.
it out.
Yeah. I think it's a good approach to be to reach for an LLM when you don't know much about certain field, but then if you are pretty knowledgeable in it, then maybe you can try to use your own brain to solve a problem. And indeed, like I think we are all in a bit of an experiment right now worldwide where we are seeing, how is this LLM use gonna evolve, and what is it gonna bring. And on that, actually, we've been kind of at the forefront of doing things with building AI agents. That's something that a lot of companies are trying to do, and that's an area that I'm also interested in. I don't know much about it, so I would be very curious to learn about your experience building AI agents in Metabase.
Yeah, that experience has been interesting, I would say. I feel like so there's one problem in our industry is that we tend to hype things a lot. So when you go out there's probably 1,000 of YouTube videos that tell you how much thousands of money you can earn every month super easily with just using N8N or some tool and build some agents. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's all bullshit. So the people who earn money are the folks who create those videos. And probably there are some cases where there's some good money to earn. But in general, it's a very overhyped topic, even though I still think there is use cases where the agents can be helpful, but I think the expectations we have are way higher than what they can actually achieve. So because
Mm.
the natural tendency out there, if you are a startup, you show the happy path, right? So you show a nice demo where things work perfectly fine. In my industry, it's like data analysis. So Metabase has a huge focus on self-serve analytics, which means you want to like ideally like not let the engineer or the data person be the bottleneck, so that you can just like find your stuff on your own and so on. And then obviously this idea of I'm just talking to my data, it's amazing, right? It's an amazing idea. And then if I see 20 demos out there where, oh, like this works so crazy, amazing well, like this thing builds me charts and dashboards and everything, sounds like super promising. The problem is that, like in all those cases, the data is very nicely curated. So it's nicely documented and described, right? And there's no ambiguity. So there's one orders table and not three, or three variations of it. The columns are not ambiguous. There's maybe a semantic layer in there where you have your metrics, and then you reduce the problem space, and the agent only needs to select from the metrics instead of finding the table and the right calculation and so on. So there's a couple of problems involved there, where usually if you take the normal company and they would connect whatever tool, whether it's Metabase or something else, usually the problem is not, the bottleneck is not the agent. The bottleneck is the data documentation. So because if you, as I said earlier, put the best data analyst you know into that company, they would struggle exactly the same way. So they would need to go out there and ask people if there's someone still around who built those data models, who does know about the data, and then they could get the information from there. So that's a big challenge with like data agents. For agents in general, it has been a very interesting journey. So I think in the beginning, when we started with some prototypes and things 1 year ago or something, it was still GPT 3.5 kind of. I think 4 was maybe coming out back in time. And it was early, I think, when I started. It doesn't matter. So times. Then you were doing things with agents. I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. Like, let me try multi-agents right away, which didn't make any sense. But I had this fun thing where I was using some framework, and then you needed some kind of like a termination word. So tell the LLM if it's think it has done its task, then it uses this word, you regex it, and then you kind of go back to the other agent or whatever. The problem I had was I had a cool setup, like a Slack bot that I built for ourselves to kind of like search. If you have a question in our Ask Me Anything data channel, usually like there were a lot of questions that you could answer right away if you know the data, or like it's just like search questions. So I built a small search bot that like was a master agent and a search agent specialized for search. Doesn't make any sense if it's just one task, but yeah, it was a cool thing to do, right? And to explore that. And then I had a situation where then I was like, why does this conversation not end? And I looked into the conversation. The search agent was ready, gave back the results. The master agent said, oh, thank you for providing the results, but didn't add the termination word. And then it went back to the other agent. The other agent, yeah, of course, I'm very happy to. And then they ended up thanking each other for like 10 turns until it reached the maximum iterations. So the models were way too stupid for those types of tasks back in time. Nowadays, they are getting better. And I would also say, like, don't use multi-agents if you don't need to, like, start simple. So, but a big challenge is still, like, if you want to use agents, you need some kind of, like, also tool calling capabilities. And some models are good at that, and others are good at with simple tools. But as soon as things get a bit more complicated, then it also ends up in a mess. And then I think the big challenge with agents is also there's a lot you need to get right. So there's a lot of parameters like the system prompt. There's then how you design your tools, like how you name your parameters, what the parameters are, how complicated is my tool, how easy is it to understand. Those are also challenges that come into when you build those things, and they are not obvious, especially since it's very hard to measure whether you improved. At Metabase, we had this big disaster when we early on started building our Metabot, where everybody was just optimizing locally. So let's say someone was building on a querying tool, the other one was building on some, I don't know, like better context awareness, and everybody was just optimizing their thing. And then when we brought stuff together, nothing did work anymore, because this is something that just doesn't work with LLMs, that you optimize too locally. You always need to see the big picture. So what is the format how I would provide a table to the LLM? Is it Markdown? Is it like JSON? Is it whatever? And depending on how you do it, it might end up very, very differently. So there's a lot of global optimization you need to do. We optimized too locally, and that ended up in like a huge disaster where basically nothing was working anymore. And I was super embarrassed in front of the CEO when I was demoing that, thinking that it still works, coming back from a conference. Yeah, that was quite fun. We learned from it. Now we try to optimize a bit more globally and have like a small benchmark, which is something that's helpful. But I don't know, like in my work with LLMs, it always feels like you shouldn't overdo everything. So like even a benchmark, it's nice, but if you try to over optimize on the benchmark, similar as with machine learning, right? So if I would overfit on my data set, then the generalization is very poor usually. And the same thing happens there. If I over optimize on my benchmark and I'm maybe going from 80% performance to 99, then maybe you don't want to reach 99 because then you start overfitting, especially since it's very hard to encapsulate this this feeling of how the vibe, like how does it feel when you work with them into a test case. So that's very, very tough. So I can test for certain query capabilities, but then how it really feels when I'm working with the LLM is a very different story. And I think this is why there's currently also like this huge discussion in LLM and agent land where we say like we don't need benchmarks. I think we need them as like a statistical unit test. So if I'm changing something and then suddenly I run the benchmark and things somewhere else, let's say I'm working on, I don't know, search, and then suddenly the benchmark for generating SQL queries drops by 30%. There's like, okay, maybe I changed something that broke something over there. So it's more like a unit test as well, like a sanity check, where it's like, okay, I need to investigate that. And otherwise, in the past, maybe this would have gone through and we would not have noticed that this SQL generation didn't work anymore. So it's more like a statistical unit test, how I see them, and like a thing that can help you at least balance out some of the work. But there's also some vibe checks going into it where you just need to play with it and see how it improves.
Yeah. So when you talk about benchmarks, I guess you are referring to evaluations, internal evaluations of the quality of the agents that you've built. And that's actually one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because I would say that's one of the challenging topics whenever you're building LLM-powered solutions, including AI agents. And still, I can imagine a lot of companies, whenever they try to build something like this, they don't really formally evaluate it. So they don't have evals as part of their CI/CD pipeline. They mostly let vibe evaluate it, if you will. So can you tell us a little bit more about the evaluations that you've been doing when building this AI agent?
Yeah, sure. So how we try to do those evaluations is that we come up with individual test cases. So you can think about those cases like this is the state of the environment. Then the user has a message. And state of the environment could also be the message history, right? So it could be that state of the environment is there is a conversation, and now I'm asking a follow-up question, or it could be a fresh start. For our case in Metabase, it could also be, so since like our AI is also like a chat interface for now, which is on the side, which should feel like a data buddy. So it should be context aware of what you're looking at. And if I'm looking at a dashboard or the result of a query, I might have a follow-up question on that. So that could also be what I mean with environment state. So a certain situation, a user message, which is basically the next task. And then we give this task to the agent. It does its thing. So it might call some tools, whatever, and come back with some kind of result or an answer. And then this is basically the test case. So we run this, we get a result. And now on those results that we have, each case might have a bunch of metrics. So we might, for example, say, like, I don't know, this was a task where it should have created a query. So there's a metric for query correctness where we would describe how the query should look like, for example, and maybe use an LLM as a judge to judge whether the query was correct or not, or use some other logic. So it should have called this tool, or it should not have called those tools. So there's a couple of those metrics, and we would basically run them on like test against the new environment, right? So environment before, agent does some stuff, environment after, and then we would check this new environment and run some metrics against it. including the responses from the agent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's usually how like such a test case looks like. And then you could imagine that we have a bunch of those. So what we try to do, obviously, is that we try to cover like a huge range of things that could come in. So if it's for querying, we would try to have cases where there's, I don't know, Boolean filters, date filters, relative date things where like I'm talking about, show me the revenue from last week. And it should be able, depending on what date we provide as the user context, be able to like choose the right date, or some combination of things and so on. And then there's not only querying, but also some other aspects where we, like, I don't know, we try to get the LLM to clarify things. So that's also a very challenging thing because it always has this tendency to just do something. And then if there's ambiguity, you might want to balance this out, or sometimes you just want to let it do something, but still provide you with the alternative options. Or sometimes it's just so ambiguous that it's better to ask. So as a good data analyst would do as well, if you ask a question in Slack, it's annoying, but you might get a question back first before you get an answer. But that's usually a good thing. And that's also hard to balance out. So that might also be like one of these areas that we have a benchmark for. So basically those test cases are aggregated into a benchmark. And then there's multiple of those benchmarks that we run in an evaluation set. And each of those gets like a score, like a pass rate. And then maybe also like those metrics, when we evaluate this, you get a score between 0 and 1. And then you get a score at the end for the whole benchmark. And then we also measure some other things like, we call it hallucination rate and hesitation rate. So when the LLM would maybe do a query, but it would do the wrong query. That's a bad thing. We don't want to like have it do some wrong things when the user, I don't know. It could even be bad if the user asks for revenue, and what the LLM does is it sees an orders table and does the sum of total, which could be a valid approach, but it might not be revenue. Like revenue can be very fine grained in terms of like how it's defined, what you need to filter out, whatever. So there are those types of aspects that we try to test with these small like metrics that we have on top of the benchmark sets. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, a lot of things that you can test for. One of the other aspects I wanted to chat to you is what kind of tools and frameworks you use to build this agent, and kind of what are the strengths and weaknesses of some tools and frameworks you've seen. What would you recommend to people who would like to build AI agents?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So in the beginning, I think we also prototype with a few frameworks, like Langchain is a very famous one, right? That a lot of people use. It also has changed a lot over time. When we built our Metabot, then for real, we didn't use any framework because we were not happy with the abstraction layers, or like the level of abstraction that we saw with a lot of those frameworks. There's this tendency of like Langchain is great to get started into a POC. I haven't checked the latest version, so like probably my information is also a bit outdated now. So I need to do this. But the problem was that there was so much magic going into things, and like the prompt that I would provide is definitely not the prompt that reaches the LLM. And then when you need to optimize for a lot of things, then it could be like very hard to optimize because you need to go very, very deep into the stack and find those weird extra prompts that are attached somewhere and so on.
Yeah.
So that was the thing we didn't want to in the beginning, because back in time it was also like way more important to provide the exact right context. It's still very important today, but now the LLMs can handle a bit more weirdness, which will not be good as well, but it works a little bit better. So another one that I was curious to play with a little bit, and also didn't do it yet, was LangGraph. That has an interesting level of abstraction because it's like not so deep into it, but it's more abstracting the graph operations and like the logic behind things. So that felt like a potential interesting sweet spot, because like just the agent loop, I mean, I can do a for loop, right? So that's like super basic to write. That's not really the complicated thing. That one looked interesting. What's also like on the horizon that I find interesting is Pydantic AI. So we're using Python for our AI service, even though Metabase itself is Clojure. But we have this separate service that we can iterate very fast, and also use the Python ecosystem just has most of the tools that are helpful. So yeah, in a personal project, a side project, I've also been playing a bit with Pydantic AI, which sounds interesting as a framework because it also has like some interesting levels of abstractions that might be helpful. But in general, I don't know. Like if you want to start out with things, feel free to try those frameworks to get started quickly and to get a sense. And then you need to decide, depending on your problem situation, what makes most sense. For us back in time, it made most sense to just like build those things for our own, because the frameworks also had some opinions that we didn't like back in time. So that was just the best choice for us. However, I need to say what is very useful to us is LightLLM. That's also like a famous library, which basically you can just use it with the OpenAI API format. So it's and then you can switch the models. I could switch to, I don't know, from some OpenAI model to Claude to Google to whatever.
Yeah.
And it takes care of the heavy lifting behind the scene to, I don't know, remap your or most of the parameters to something else. So there's still a lot of hiccups there as well. But that's something that we use that helps us to quickly switch between models and quickly try new things without need to rewrite everything, because then our API stays rather stable. So sometimes you also need to add additional parameters and stuff. So it's not so nice as the story tells, but it's still a very helpful thing where you can like just quickly switch out some parts without the need to change everything. Because like initially we tried to I know, play with Bedrock, for example, which has a very, very different API than OpenAI. So when we wanted to switch between those, we needed to write some like own code snippets, maintain them, and that's just something that's like cooler if the community does that, and we can benefit from it. So that's a cool thing I would recommend folks to play with and try. But some other frameworks like Pydantic AI, they also provide this kind of out of the box. So they also do some kind of abstraction for you there, which is also quite nice and also helpful.
Nice, very useful. Some of these, especially Pydantic AI, I've heard about it, but I haven't also had the time to look into it. But sounds cool. But another more practical topic, whenever you're building agents and anything with an LLM behind it, is costs. Like, how do you how do you make sure that you don't go over the budget, if you will?
Yeah, costs are an interesting topic. So since we talked about benchmarks, we I think we had it got cheaper by now because we did some things, but like when we tried to use some bigger models, then maybe back in time, I don't know, like we are still very cheap, I would say, with that, but maybe a benchmark run costs, I don't know, let's say $10 or 20, depending on what model you use, or maybe $1, depending on the model you use. And I don't know, if it costs $20, you might not run this with every CI pipeline, right? That can get a huge cost factor, especially if I'm pushing something on my PR, it runs, then I'm pushing another change, it runs again, it runs again, it runs again. So this can add up quite quickly. So that's a thing where you need to be very intentional about when to run those things. Since it's not as cheap as a normal unit test you just quickly run somewhere, right? So there's definitely some costs associated with it. So in general, like at Metabase, we are very chill about that. So like people do things with their own judgment, and we would talk about it from time to time. But it generally works out quite well, I would say. Yeah, but it's very different from normal software engineering, because like whatever you do, you can use LLMs as a building block for your solution, but they can get very expensive quite quickly if you don't watch out for it. They can also be surprisingly cheap for some tasks. I don't know, if you create embeddings or maybe use some super small models for certain things, you can have thousands of calls and might not even pay $1 for it. And that's totally fine. But it's definitely also a challenge for the product and the pricing then eventually, right?
Yeah.
Because if you the pricing is a whole different story for itself. Like, do you want to like just put a margin on top of a token, or do it somewhat differently with some kind of like a flat rate, whatever? So like that's a huge challenge for its own. But definitely, then whatever you build. So let's say you build with a medium-sized model, put your pricing strategy on top, and maybe it's some kind of like a thing where you don't like use the token, but something else. Like in our case, for example, you could imagine it might make sense if I'm using Metabase. I don't want to pay for the token, but some concept that I can understand as a user, which could be like a request. So I'm typing something, I get an answer back, and maybe I pay for that thing. And I don't care how many loops the agent does in between. I'm just like, when I get it, like that's something I can, as a user, I can grasp. So okay, that makes sense for me. And whatever tokens is, I don't know.
Yeah.
So like there's aspects to that, but then you can imagine that such a request, depending on what model you use, it's maybe, I don't know, 1 cent, or if I use another model, it's 10x. And then this could really break your pricing strategy quite quickly. And since the models are also evolving so fast, I mean, they usually tend to get a bit cheaper, I would say, on average. But still, it could be that a new model comes out and you want to switch to that because suddenly the performance is insanely better. But now, if your pricing strategy doesn't work out anymore, then increasing prices is really weird for the users, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's like a huge challenge I see with LLMs, like from a product perspective, but also if you're developing with it, obviously evals and so on. We are still pretty cheap with our evals, but if you go with other companies that, I don't know, might run the official things, or Sweebench if it's coding agents and stuff like that, that can get to hundreds of dollars per run really quickly. So yeah, you need to be very, very intentional about it. And that's kind of a limiting factor, because you can just do it as often as you want and try, like good old machine learning times. You might have like a grid search with like all the parameter combination, which took time and like costed you computing time locally, but you could run it locally. But then if you always need like to call this API and pay for everything, such a grid search could get very expensive. You might want to do it to figure out what's the best space I want to be in terms of parameters, but that might not be affordable at all.
Yeah, a lot of new challenges, and also with in the recent years, together with LLMs becoming more and more widely used, there has also been a trend of junior employees not being hired as much in companies. Most companies prefer to hire strong, medium, or senior employees, which can especially become very powerful with using LLMs. So maybe one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what is your advice to people coming out of university, or junior data scientists or AI engineers? What can they do to become better, find a job, to thrive in their new company?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And honestly, I probably don't have a really good answer for it. So like, just thinking out loud, I think there's a couple of aspects. So yes, I think senior people can benefit from LLMs a lot, potentially, like what we talked about earlier, because you have this smell that you also understand whether like a proposed solution is good or not, and you can easily use it for bouncing off ideas and so on, where somebody more junior might not have this understanding yet, and then just go off that solution and do it. On the other hand, when we started our career early on, we all did those weird things, right? So we did some weird, used some weird solutions for problems that didn't make sense. Or then you do a PR review, you get slapped on your fingers a lot, and it's like, oh no, we should not do it this way, and you need to iterate and learn a lot. So there's always this learning aspect. I guess my number one advice that like always helped me throughout my career, to be honest, without LLMs early on, so different story, but still, I feel like stay curious, like, and try to follow your curiosity. So if you have something that you find interesting, just try to understand it. Like, read about it, play with it, use LLMs as well. I feel like you can, if you understand how to use them, there's still a huge potential for you to be better than a lot of other people, and to be a differentiator. I would say maybe if you scroll back 10 years, then it's probably, if you could use Google in a nice way, in a good way, then you would be way better than other people, because you would find the resources necessary. I think that's still an important skill. And probably that's a new skill that people should also like train when they use LLMs. And I mean, we are also a little bit in our bubble, right? So if we talk to others, it's like, if you don't use LLMs, like, it's almost like a no-brainer to play with them, right? So everybody has heard about them, and everybody kind of played with them. But if I look outside of that, in other companies or other businesses, a lot of people, they kind of play a little bit with it, but maybe like haven't used it at all in their day-to-day life. They don't have an idea on where they can be a good tool and where not. That's probably an interesting skill to develop. So don't see it as the hammer and everything is a nail, but try to understand when is it a good tool to use and when not. Because we also see those studies where like we all think we are more productive, but then studies say actually when you use LLMs, you're less productive. And I think that comes from the fact of that you don't know when to use them. So there are situations where it makes a ton of sense, where they are the perfect tool. And there are situations where they are just not the right tool. And then it might be way better to like do something else. Yeah, so that's like my loud thoughts on that. But I feel like trying to get a sense of the more senior things, like trying to get a sense for software architecture, how you design things, that is something that at least right now, it feels to me like having that skill is very useful and kind of let me benefit a lot with the work with LLMs as well. You should also probably understand how to code. So that's also useful. So don't rely on the LLMs doing everything. Just also like treat yourself a little bit to try to do some coding or at least like understand what is generated there and just don't blindly trust everything. That's probably also a good skill. Yeah. So, but there's this notion that I feel, yes, now we hire mostly senior folks in the industry, but I also feel that junior folks could have this huge progressive benefit that they might be very curious and not biased towards some old stuff that we did. And we know it all, right? So we all complain about people being in the industry for a long time and like developing this mindset of, yeah, we always did it like that. So that's why we continue doing it like that. And there are people around like that, and they just don't move forward too much anymore. But young people usually, or junior people usually, have this tendency to be very progressive. So they hear about new technology and stuff. Sometimes you need to hit the brakes a little bit on that. But on the other hand, I feel this can be a very important skill as well, to learn quickly how to use LLMs, how to play. And that can be a good asset in your company as well. So maybe it also makes sense to actually still hire a lot of junior folks for the team.
Yeah. But indeed, this notion that junior people come up with some more creative and more less encumbered mind and new way to solve the problems, I think it's definitely true. And as I've been progressing in my career, I've also been seeing this. And otherwise, the thing about using LLMs is, I think you kind of mentioned this, is that you have to balance between using an LLM maybe to make the delivery of your project quicker, but at the same time you should also be you should use it in an intentional way and in a way that you learn you need to learn the things from first principles. I would say don't use an LLM blindly. Try to understand the basic principles behind what it's suggesting. And sometimes it's difficult because you mentioned the hallucinations and the tendency of an LLM to always give you a coherent answer. That's good, but it also means that it has an incentive to make up stuff and maybe lie to you, not intentionally, but that's how it's been designed.
Yeah, there's also like an interesting aspect that you mentioned earlier in our discussion, which is I think it's probably also a good practice to roughly understand how those things work. So they are no rocket science, right? So like you need to go super deeply. You don't need to go super deeply into the formulas and whatever, but understand it on a high level what those things are. And as you mentioned earlier with like machine learning models, I feel it's very similar. So if you have a good mental model of what those things do and why they do things in a certain way, it's way easier to understand where they can be a good tool and where they might reach their limitations. I remember like early on when I played with those machine learning models and I thought everything is magic, but as soon as you understand how the different types of models work, like how a random forest works or like a tree model works compared to a linear regression model or like a logistic classifier, they all have their pros and cons and situations where they can shine in what they were built for and situations where they were not built for. And if you kind of understand the logic behind them, then it's usually easier to judge. Also, when you run into problems, it's easier to figure out why that happened. But I think the most important thing is it's easier to judge when this thing is the right tool and when you should like not say it's the right tool.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground with a lot of interesting areas. We discussed product management, agricultural science, building AI agents, working remote, all kinds of stuff like this. Did we miss anything? Is there something that you want to talk about, or maybe some advice you have to people, or maybe where they can follow you, or anything at all? Feel free to mention it.
Yeah, I think we actually we covered a lot of hopefully interesting stuff. Maybe like to summarize. So in case you want to follow me, I guess LinkedIn is the best place. So that's where I try to get most of my information from the industry. I'm also on X, but I'm like not really active there. So for me, it's I guess mostly LinkedIn is something if you want to get hopefully interesting content from myself from time to time, then go there. I try to make it not saley. I hate that LinkedIn is turning into something like where people just try to sell their stuff all the way and there's not so much interesting information anymore. So I just want to give something useful back to the community. But yeah, to sum it up, so I guess what I want people to take away from that, like when I think through our conversation is like when you are like still junior, stay curious, like follow your curiosity, even if it sounds like a weird path, right? So when I was doing the switch, I was not sure whether this is a good decision or not. And it was like a really, like I was at the bottom of my career. I was like, okay, this like I need to start from scratch, felt super weird. But after going through that, I felt like nothing can beat me anymore. Like there cannot be a problem that I would be afraid of anymore because I went through all that crazy stuff. And if you develop that, that's so helpful because I mean, sometimes maybe you're also a bit naive in certain things. That happens to me as well. But I felt like this made me a very happy person because I followed my curiosity, and now I'm working with something that I would also consider my hobby. So it's a very fine line between what is hobby and what is then work. So that's cool. So follow that. Try to become good at communication. I think this is where you can stand out compared to others. So that was potentially something interesting we covered there. That like read about that stuff, how you do that, and then try to apply it. Because this is where a lot of very, very good people are very, very bad at. So this is where you can shine. So yeah, that's maybe a good thing to end.
Yeah, it's very nice because many times these more basic advice is really what's needed for somebody to get to the next level. So yeah, thanks for this, and yeah, thanks very much for the conversation, Thomas. I think it was very, very useful and very interesting one. And yeah, thanks for the listeners of the AI and ML Conversation podcast. And yeah, Thomas, see you, and the listeners see you as well next time.
Yo, thank you. See you, folks.
Thanks for listening to the AI and ML Conversations with myself, Javor Botev. If you want to support the show, please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. In addition, please follow the podcast on Spotify and Apple and share it with the people you know. Thank you.